In this episode 2 of Supernatural, we look at the movements that happened in the 1990s and explore the emergence of a new kind of god with the rise of the male supermodel.
Well, let me look at this calendar here. Now, there's this picture on the front here.
The 90s took us to the edge of the new millennium. It was the decade where pop culture became part of the mainstream. We saw a rise in the awareness of multiculturalism, as well as the advance of alternative media. Movements such as the grunge and rave scenes and hip-hop spread to young people around the world during this decade.
When I say Arsenio, you say Hall. Arsenio, Hall. Arsenio, Hall. Accident consulted that makes us eternal like a picture. Your picture, our picture, resurrect a richer future.
Aided by then new technology such as cable television and the World Wide Web.
Fashion or anything that happens is reflective of the decade that you're in. The 50s was kind of the answer to post-World War, to malaise and a celebration of opportunity and prosperity. The 60s was a youthquake, with people taking chances and rebelling. The 90s was kind of a strange decade where there were these incongruities. There was the advent of technology, and the internet was coming into play. Personal computers were becoming part of everyday life. Cell phones, although they were the size of small compact cars at that point, people started using them. It was a time of change. There was change happening.
It was a golden age for culture and the arts. And there was rapture from the very get-go with the release of Nirvana's groundbreaking album, Nevermind, in 1991.
When Kurt Cobain arrived, it had such an impact. It shifted the universe. It shifted the style from this oversized, powerful to this skinny, more emotional, romantic, vintage vibe. It just completely shifted the whole world with Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love too. Actually, it was such a shift in fashion.
In fashion, I think the incongruities. There was the excess of chains and flowers and camellias at Chanel, and then there was the anti-fashion aesthetic of grunge, inspired by Kurt Cobain.
Hi, this is Jim Moore. We're in Williamsburg, Brooklyn.
I'm a freelance creative director. I am creative director at large at GQ Magazine here in America. I've had an amazing run at GQ for the last 40 years. So grunge was a real disruptor in the fashion sphere. And a lot of the fashion was really based on, a very eclectic style. T-shirts from a thrift store, maybe a suede jacket with fringes on it. The whole thing was really started with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana and those videos and how cool his style was and those vintage cardigans and the way he wore a T-shirt. And we never really, up until then, saw T-shirts as an important part of the fashion vernacular. And when he brought it into fashion, it became the rage.
Then just a few years later in 1994, we collectively grieved when Kurt Cobain died. The first 3 Harry Potter books were published in the 90s. HBO launched The Sopranos, Tarantino gave us Pulp Fiction, and Pixar gave us Toy Story.
Hey, Buzz! You're flying!
This isn't flying, this is falling with style.
To infinity and beyond!
It was also a golden age for television, with the arrival of Seinfeld, The Simpsons, Friends, and NYPD Blue. The digital age was finally fully underway. At the beginning of the decade, almost none of us have heard of the web. And we didn't have browsers, search engines, digital cell phone networks, fully 3D games, or affordable and powerful laptops. By the end of the decade, we had them all. The global economy was booming, and the US unemployment rate was at its lowest level in more than 2 decades. Americans had money to spend. In what some economists call a luxury fever, consumers spent their money on designer brands, bigger and more expensive television sets, automobiles, and houses. Also in the early 90s, fashions worn by hip-hop artists were increasingly becoming mainstream. And because of the growing popularity of hip-hop music among the suburban community, urban styles were seen everywhere, not just in the big cities.
The Wu-Tang could be dangerous.
Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar bill, yo.
By the late 1990s, hip-hop style was arguably the most popular style amongst young people. Starting in the mid-90s, industrial and military styles crept into mainstream fashion. People were finding any way to make a fashion accessory out of a piece of machinery. Camouflage pants, ironically, started to be worn by anti-war protesters, as well as everyone else. By the late 90s, rave culture had swept past, and people were looking for clothes that were more glamorous again. The grungy styles of the early 90s seemed old hat. Looking rich was cool again. Big-name designer brands were back in a big way. The blossoming of gym culture in the early 80s meant middle American manhood was primed for self-improvement. By the 90s, we were putting in work to get those six-packs and guns.
Thighs, and then you turn it up because the biceps has 2 jobs to do. One is to lift up the forearm, and the other one is to turn the wrist. So that's what we do for movement.
Yeah?
Okay, very good, yeah.
Okay, well, we've got some...
You're already pumped up, I can't believe that.
Star athletes became the new gods.
Michael Jordan. 55 seconds to go. They lead by 7 with 38. Jordan. 57 points for Michael Jordan.
He said he's not looking for the Tyson of one McGillian Mathis. There's a combination uppercut by Tyson. Tyson laying it on, pouring it on. Down goes Bruno into the rope. It is all over. It is all over here in round 3. Mike Tyson is champion again.
It was a time when men shook hands like real men.
You son of a bitch. What's the matter? The CIA got you pushing too many pencils? Huh?
In the 90s, it was about being athletically fit. I remember walking around New York City, never wearing a shirt, kind of going back to my Jamaican roots. I'd be on the subway with my backpack, my Walkman at the time, and just jamming the music. And, you know, here I am, chiseled, ripped, abs, you know. It's like 90 degrees on the train. Everybody's sweating, but I'm not even sweating. I'm just bobbing my head to some hip hop music with my backpack on my way to probably the Bronx or Brooklyn, one of those, because I used to always go back and forth. And it was just like, whenever you saw a guy that was in shape, you kind of gave him the nod, and you know, it was just like, hey man, where you work out?
We saw the emergence of some really key male models that were very diverse in look and definitely held like the core and the root of different campaigns. You know, most of the campaigns that I started to do in the 90s, there was always a male counterpart instead of several women, instead of one woman, but there was this anchor of the male and what played out in that, which was sensuality and all sorts of exploration. And it definitely added a different ambiance and nuance to the modeling industry at that time. And I don't know if we've continued to see anything like that. It was definitely in that moment. I believe that all of these men who moved into their own supermodel status all had something very different and specific to offer. And I believe part of that, like many of us, it was their life story. It was, of course, their physicality, but it was their willingness to participate in front of a camera and tell a story and be part of a story and show more of themselves than what was previously ever wanted.
Many experts say it was photographer Bruce Weber and his work in the 90s who lit the spark for a cultural revolution.
There was this emergence of masculinity and male models at that time, and it wasn't just your generic. They had really specific looks. Jimon Hansu, who's an incredible actor, Tyson Beckford. There was a dawning at that time of these individuals from all over the world, and Marcus Scheckenberg, of course, you know, that I was able to work with, and they were my counterparts. So it brought a different element to the shoots, and definitely they became a really important part of the fashion industry at that time. And I still don't believe that they've received the recognition and accolades that they should have. It's the one industry where men were paid less than women, and that they were eye candy to a certain extent. And a lot of the public didn't know their names because they were so fixated on the supermodels, but they were really this indelible impact and part of the industry at that time and really changed the face of the industry.
Paul Cavaco was the former fashion director of Harper's Bazaar and American Vogue, an ex-creative director at Allure magazine. During his 40-year career, he also had a hand in many of the most iconic brand campaigns for Calvin Klein, Versace, Chanel, and worked closely with top photographers including Richard Avedon, Mario Testino, Bruce Weber, and Steven Meisel.
I always want to be in love. When we're photographing someone, I'm in love with that person. For that amount of time, if I'm not in love, I can't get into the picture.
Through the 80s and 90s, he worked with virtually all the supermodels, as well as icons like Madonna.
I think Bruce Weber actually changed, you know, how we feel about photographing men, how we feel about male beauty. And I think before it was considered very vain to think about your body. It was very vain to even talk about your body. To say you went to the gym, you were not supposed to really have that conversation, you know, and the aesthetic before Bruce came was very sort of, you know, for male models was very tall, thin, and Bruce changed that to be a much more athletic, much more, almost an American sensibility.
So in the early days when we were working with Bruce Weber and we were kind of readjusting or reimagining, you know, what the new GQ was. And if you think about the 70s, it was literally the Peacock era. It was the Studio 54 era. It was a little bit more showy. There was more dazzle, so to speak. And it was also a very glamorous era. I know that it's one of my favorite eras to respond to. I mean, there was an idea of masculinity, there was an idea of macho that was very cool. And I know people like Tom Ford kind of, rest into that kind of inspiration, as do I. But the 80s were about realness, and it was about athleticism. And instead of choosing models, Bruce Weber, who was a huge influence on GQ's, journey at that moment, was really adamant about, going to the local colleges wherever we were shooting, or setting up castings that would happen before we got on set. And, he was really adamant about this idea of male masculinity, which was based around the athlete.
Bruce Weber was born and raised just outside Pittsburgh, in the farming and coal mining town of Greensburg. His love affair with the camera started early. Bruce would often spend Sunday afternoons doing art projects and making 8mm films in his backyard. In 1966, after a couple of years studying art at Denison College in Ohio, Weber transferred to New York University to study acting. His first apartment was a 5th-floor walk-up between Little Italy and Chinatown. Freezing in the winter, blazing in the summer. It was there that Bruce built his first small darkroom and started taking headshot portraits for actors and actresses, and also new models like Beth Ann Hardison, who were just starting out. In many ways, this proved to be a great training for his future as a fashion and portrait photographer. Bruce would talk endlessly with each person about what they wanted their headshot to express, and how to communicate that feeling through the clothes they would wear and the lighting he would use.
I had wonderful experiences with Bruce. For me, Bruce was there to listen to my story, and it invited me to tell a story through movement and through imagery. And it was always incredibly collaborative with guidelines, with like, this is where we are and what we're doing. So show me who you are within this context. So my experiences with Bruce, from everything from the Harley Davidson, the epic Harley Davidson, was just this like constant invitation for me to be what I was, definitely at that point, which was this rebel, which was a runaway, which was this definitely like unfinished character, very unruly, like all of those things I was invited to bring to the table in the leather pants and the blue jeans and, the motorcycles and the slung guitar over my shoulder. So it was always really pleasant and collaborative with him.
He was magnificent to work with because I think he was a model at the early days, and he made you feel special. I had nothing but amazing times with him and his teams. I really did. And I mean, so many trips and so much fun. And yeah, he's up there with the greats for sure.
I think Bruce was a genius at the time because him, and I always say this, once you've done it yourself, it's easier to see the vision. Like Bruce once was a male model, so he saw and understood the masculinity of the male image, which he was able to capture. The day that I went to his studios to meet him, I'm this tough street kid, who's at that time, I probably already been in like 25 uncontested street fights where it was either you're gonna fight or die kind of fights, So I was a little tough and rough around the edges. So when I got there, when I walked into Bruce's office, I had that tough kind of demeanor. But then when I saw him, he was like Santa Claus to me. So I was like, you can't be tough with Santa Claus, So, I let my guard down and I was cool with him. And then he said, look, he's like, yo, did you play sports? And I said, yeah, I used to play football and I do a little bit of boxing. So he had me take some Polaroids, and it was real genuine, cool conversation. I felt like I had known him for a long time. And, he said thank you and have a nice day. And, we talked about my manager, Beth Ann, and his love for her. And, he just was such a humble man. And I didn't think anything of it. And he said something like, oh, I think my friend Ralph would love these. And I didn't think anything of it. So then, I went on my way.
So for me, Bruce Weber's imagery, I didn't experience it when I was growing up. I found about him when I started to work in fashion a little bit later. It was very natural and sort of like not being too scared of being sexy. I see his photography as freedom. His black and white, daylight black and white is so gorgeous and timeless, and you can still look at pictures now and it doesn't get old. So because I don't see him as a fashion photographer. He's an art photographer. He does shoot fashion, but what he shoots are still relevant today in a way. And one of my favorite shoot that he's done I think it was for Loma Vogue with Joe McKenna, I think. And there was a boy wearing a Philip Tracy, a boat hat. I remember I had that on my wall in high school. And I found out later that was Bruce Weber. And I thought it was so beautiful. Someone very masculine was wearing a female hat. For me, it was like mind-blowing.
Traditionally, modelling had always been a woman's domain. Economics, simply put, women bought more fashion and beauty products than men, and simple psychology had always conspired to make it so. Women had always felt much more comfortable looking at pictures of other beautiful women than men did looking at pictures of other handsome men.
I think in the 70s, the male model was actually used more like almost like a mannequin for his height, for his general proportion to wear clothing, and his good looks. But, it was very specific. They had to fit into a mold. I think when Bruce Weber came along in the late 70s, early 80s, that started to change. And I think by the time we get to the late 80s and 90s, I think the male model is actually not quite, but almost as famous as the female models. And we do know a lot of them by their first names. They do appear not only as accessories to women's fashion, but they, in their own right, start taking over. There's a lot more male advertising. There's more magazines that are more general interests, like Vanity Fair, where the audience, the readership is male.
It was a very interesting time. It was a very robust time for fashion. I always say the 90s were the beginning of the big time era because everything was starting to match up with women's fashion. The shows were almost as big. Men's Fashion Week was a little bit more of a circus than it had been before. There were more players. Milan Fashion Week was the place to be. A lot of times the men's shows had women in them because the men's shows always came before the women's shows. So designers like Gianni Versace would put a few women in his men's shows to kind of give a sneak peek into what was going to be to come for the women's.
Historically, men responded more to achievement, athletes and actors, rather than male good looks. For men, it was more socially acceptable to be in awe of the physiques of Olympian Carl Lewis.
And America may have got 1, 2, 3. What a celebration in this stadium. Just listen to them. 92,000 people.
Or movie characters like Yvonne Drago and Rocky Balboa in Rocky IV.
Rocky Balboa trying to stay in the middle of the ring against the big Russian. Move there!
And it was going to be for a male to lust after the physique of, say, Travis Fimmel on his Sunset Boulevard billboard, standing proud in his Calvin Klein underwear. Even to this day, straight men are concerned about being called out for exhibiting gay tendencies when they gaze too long at a fellow male's body who isn't an athlete.
Look what you did to my jacket! Ball gazer! Oh, go ahead! Oh! Oh, you bastard! You totally caught me in the
When Ralph Lauren started his fashion company in 1967 by selling slightly wider than the norm neckties, he had big dreams. Far more than neckties. He had a vision of creating a global empire, something no other American fashion brand had managed to do before. And to do that, he knew he needed to do what the Coca-Cola Company of Atlanta and Philip Morris of New York did. That was to enlist the power of advertising.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honeybees and snow white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me. Perfect harmony. Perfect harmony. I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. And the real thing. I'd like to teach the world to sing. In perfect harmony. Perfectly. And I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. It's the real thing. What the world wants today.
By the time the 1970s rolled around, the two most recognizable brands on the planet were Coca-Cola and Marlboro. They were literally everywhere. Both brands were quintessentially American brands. Back then, even in the most remote corners of the globe, wherever you found a shack selling things, you would see advertising signs for those two American brands. Coke became the real thing, and Philip Morris gave us Marlboro Country, the cowboy, and lots of lung cancer to boot.
You don't see many wild stallions anymore. He's one of the last of a wild and very singular breed. Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro Country.
Historically, luxury fashion brands had built their brand's image largely off the back of a founder-designer. Yves Saint Laurent, Christian Dior, Valentino. Their business focus was largely on design rather than marketing. The same design focus that went into each season's new collection, along with their flagship stores and the seasonal runway presentations for the press. Back when Ralph started, global advertising campaigns for fashion brands were unheard of. Now they are an essential factor if you want to be on top. Through the past 50 years, Ralph single-handedly reinvented the idea of the fashion business.
Here's a Jewish guy, right? And like anglicize his name, Lipschitz. He's not a designer. He can't sketch. He can't do none of those things that would produce a good garment. And he completely revolutionized the fashion industry through marketing.
Polo alone is that brand of greatness. You feel distinguished. You might add $2 in your pocket, but you're looking like $1 million.
It was 1991. Ralph Lauren and his team were at work on their next collection, which would debut the following spring. Polo had always been inspired by the sporting life, but with this collection would put athleticism front and center in a nod to the upcoming 1992 Olympic Summer Games in Barcelona. Ralph and his team researched and reimagined historical track and field iconography, vintage athlete uniforms, and glamorous images of the 1930s Olympic posters to create a bold series of designs constructed with a new athletic spirit. The result, the now legendary Stadium collection, brought together all of those influences in an all-new line, Polo Sport. According to Jerry Lauren, Ralph's brother, Polo Sport was as much a part of Ralph's American dream as anything else he'd done in the prior quarter century. It was very much polo, he said, but it gave another dimension to polo. It was the idea of the Olympics on the street, wherever you go.
I had a casting at Ralph Lauren. They were like, well, they saw that from my muscular build and my physique, like they were casting for suits. And they said, well, you're really not what we're looking for in suits right now. So you mind coming back next week for something, more sporty. So I went back on a Thursday. I took Polaroids with them, and they said, you mind waiting? We want to run up to Ralph's office and show him these. And I didn't think anything of it. It was a guy named Ralph. I didn't think it was the Ralph Lauren. So they go upstairs, they come back kind of like giddy, like schoolgirls. And I'm just like, okay. And they say, thank you for your time. Have a great day. And that was it. And I was like, I didn't think anything of it. So I said, thank you, on my way, polite and cordial as usual. And then I went like window shopping 2 blocks away. And I remember where I was standing when my phone rang. And they were like, you just booked the fall winter campaign for Polo Sport, which was like, that was like one of the biggest, jobs I'd ever booked. And here I am. I'm not even a full year into the fashion world, or the fashion industry before, the whole year hadn't even come full circle.
Yes, that's right, the same Polo Sport campaign that kick-started my career all the way to global stardom back in 1994. The holy trinity at that point was Ralph, Bruce, and Tyson. The media reported a success from the start. Polo Sport swept both the fashion landscape and the broader world of world culture, spurred on by the meteoric rise of 23-year-old model Tyson Beckford, who would star in a series of Polo Sport campaigns, often alongside supermodel Naomi Campbell, embodying the ethos of the brand while biking, boxing, running, and jet skiing. Ralph had predated today's mega trend of athleisure by almost 3 decades.
Tyson, right ahead, please. Bridget! Tyson, Bridget, straight ahead. I expected them to run out of film by now.
I'd already had like Gap and, all these other things underneath my belt before I even had met Bruce. In my connections with street stuff, and I'd already been in like little music videos, and I was blossoming. And basically meeting Bruce just, it just put more fuel into the tank, more octane to get me to where I was. And then once Bruce sent me over to Ralph, and then we did these amazing pictures on this mountain in Squaw Valley. I remember it coming out that fall, and it took off. And by October the following year, it was just superstardom, I guess, for fashion. I hadn't signed the full contract with Ralph at the time, so I was still doing music videos. I was doing stuff for Gap. I was doing national ads everywhere else.
At that time, there was clothing, and then there was workout clothing. This was a fashion brand moving into that space in a very different way.
When Ralph Lauren first found out I was from the Bronx, it was really the beginning of a bond. I remember we were at a presentation, and he saw me. I was in a suit, and he came up to me, and he's like, "Yeah, I hear you're from the Bronx." And I'm like, "Yeah," and we kind of started. That's when I knew that the fondness and the bond was beyond me being modeled for said corporation. At the time, there weren't so many outspoken models, and I was very outspoken about everything, whether it was politics, whether it was mistreatment of something. I was always outspoken. And then when they figured out this guy could be a great spokesperson for us, and then they hired me, and then I was going on tours and in stores. Kids were coming to get autographs from the guy in the Polo Sport ad, and it just was like, it's almost like surreal rock star, which I don't ever remember like any of those guys doing anything on the calibers that I was doing, because here I am, I just started doing a little bit of movie stuff. I just started doing some TV stuff. I was doing the whole fashion thing, and I was doing the in-stores, and my picture was on the side of buses and bus stops and billboards. And it was a black image, which America hadn't seen. You open a Vanity Fair, and there I was in this $4,000 purple label suit, looking very regal, very, very belonging there. It just was something that you hadn't seen before.
Whilst Ralph may have led the way in this new global marketing approach, fellow Bronx-born designer Calvin Klein was not far behind.
Now, you're not only a designer. According to 20 years worth of press, you're a marketing genius. I have a quote. I don't hard sell anything. My attitude is if you want to sell jeans, don't talk about them.
I think what I was getting at was is that you want to convey an image about what we stand for, whether it's fragrance, whether it's clothing, whether it's accessories, whatever it is. At the same time, what you want to do is create excitement. You want people to notice your ads, your print ads, or your commercials.
I tried to think what became of her. That haunting, exquisite creature.
Shouts goes out to my man Calvin Klein, good looking out for the drawers. Not saying I would do another Fruit of the Loom commercial or nothing like that, because they don't make the hype shorts. These are the 90s, man. They just fit good and they hold me snug. So if I'm about to go get some skins, I'm not going to put on like no silk underwear. Next question.
Calvin Klein also showed he was a savant when it came to marketing, and he too shared a drive to make his brand a global icon. There was undoubtedly a fierce rivalry between Ralph and Calvin. Both were the children of Jewish immigrant parents. Both grew up in the Bronx, New York City. Both started their fashion companies around the same time.
Ralph Lauren grew up in the same neighborhood, and Ralph always dressed in sort of a peculiar way. I was the edgy one. I wanted to look like some tough guy like James Dean. And Ralph looked like he was some other foreign country.
I was a cool guy. I was cool. I never thought about style. I didn't know what that word meant. I would say I was more, I had a sense of, I felt I had a sense of leadership. My life and my career has been an accumulation of build. I think it's not a breakthrough. It's a matter of staying on a path, staying in a direction, having a point of view, believing in what you're doing, and having the scope and the focus to say, this is who I want to be, this is what I like. My sense was I had an integrity inside me about what I believed in. I did it honestly, but I had a point of view, I was very strong.
But in the next week, we'll be planning. But it's all of this. I mean, look at New York.
You could say their rivalry was like that of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. It was intense. In the early years, both men would trade campaign for campaign. Each season, they pushed each other higher and higher. Weirdly enough, whilst their advertising campaigns were quite different, they were both created by the same master image maker, photographer Bruce Weber. It's hard to downplay the impact that photographer Bruce Weber had on our popular culture and male beauty ideals, be it through his brand campaigns, magazine editorials, art books, and films.
Bruce Weber takes photographs like a Hollywood photographer. You know, it always, and I started my life, and Bruce started his life with me. When Bruce first started taking a photography, I was one of his little, as me and him used to go to the park every Saturday, and he'd take pictures of me because he was just starting. Who would have ever thought that he'd become so successful? When we're young kids, I still use the picture of me that he hated that I used because there's a branch in front of my face. But you knew that he had quality. When I worked at Click, that's where you really discovered everything that we were doing. Between us and Bruce at Click, we put the images on the map. We had that control because Bruce liked anybody he found, he put them with us. Those are the kids who wind up working for Ralph. It was like a train of things because we all sort of were on the same page. We had the same taste, the same ideas.
Bruce has said, "When people hire me, I think about the person I'm working for, not the company. When I started working for Ralph, I got to know his family. We had a lot of common interests, cars, old clothes, so I began by photographing his world." Calvin always had this really glamorous New York life, out at clubs and parties all the time. In a sense, that's what I was photographing for him. That desire and passion he had to live that way. It wasn't my world, it was his. That has always been the fun part, going into these other worlds.
So, the idea of what he's done, is iconic and will live to the end of time. If you have any memory about what was when you think back of all the Ralph Lauren shoots and things like that, or any other editorials that that he's done. The addition of having Calvin Klein. All of those different between Ralph and Calvin and anybody and he had those two. It felt like a decade, of shooting those images. He built the image, he built the brands. That's when you have creative directors who do things like that. But just a photographer, there's no whole bars on that.
The incredible thing I think about Bruce Weber is how Calvin Klein, the image of Calvin Klein, the image of Ralph Lauren is actually based on what Bruce's interpretation of their aesthetic is. He understood Calvin's aesthetic, he understood Ralph's aesthetic, and he understood how to sort of give it a context photographically, how to give it a place, how to give it the right person, the right people, how to populate it with the right models. He's brilliant in that way. He has sort of the ability to get into the psyche of the people he's working for and create something based on that they may not have even known existed. They may not have known that that's what it was going to turn out to be.
I think Bruce Weber is legendary because he ushered in realness and male sensuality and a sexy quality that men were excited to see, women were excited to see, and it was based on athleticism, and it was based on good-looking guys that maybe weren't always supermodels. But when they were put in Bruce's hands, he would make them look like gods. He would make them look like movie stars. To Bruce's credit, he loved to kind of, find the new model, experiment. You'd show up at a shoot and you thought there'd be 4 models there and there were 8 models there because he wanted to try these kind of new kids. And once in a while, the new kid was the one that looked the best in the pictures.
I think the wonderful thing about all of the designers that worked with Bruce is they never came on set. They trusted Bruce and the people that he chose to work with to create this. And I think it was that freedom to create that allowed Bruce to actually do these incredible iconic ads for people.
Just like in the 90s where there were just a few supermodels. I think there were only a handful of photographers that all of the designers were clamoring to use for their campaigns. And a Versace or an Armani or a Ralph Lauren, they weren't afraid to use Merton Marcus because all of them were kind of clamoring to use these photographers like Bruce or Merton Marcus or Ineza Minoud or Mario Testino, these photographers that could pivot. You could still get a picture that looked very Bruce Weber or looked very Stephen Klein, but through the lens of the designer. And no one did that better than Bruce, because Bruce really, he'd been with Ralph for many, many years, knew how to take that kind of class photograph of, idealism. But he could also do the sexiness of Versace, and he could do the austereness of Calvin. And it was, in a way, it's all the same photographer, but it's like the pivot. So maybe Calvin is in a studio and Ralph is on location, and Versace is in the Versace mansion, whatever it is.
Some say the shift that enabled the rise of the male supermodel in the 90s actually started as far back as December 78, when the Soho Weekly News ran a portfolio of images by a relatively unknown photographer named Bruce Weber. Paul Cavaco was the fashion director at the Soho Weekly News at the time. He was also the men's fashion director of American Vogue. Paul remembers the events.
In the late 70s, I was working at the Soho Weekly News doing the menswear. And it was the November issue, and Keisha said, well, it's November issue. In Vogue, we always did lingerie because it's like, getting ready to purchase things for Christmas. So we thought, let's do an underwear thing. So we called Bruce and said, we want to do an underwear story. And he said, perfect, I found this boy that I just was used in GQ, and I'll fly him in. We go to the studio, which is a tiny little studio, daylight studio, with a mattress on the floor. And, this very beautiful boy comes in, different than male models at that time. He had the height, but he was much more naturally built. So the model was a boy called Jeff Aquilon. He was the captain of the water polo team. He came in, we told him we were going to shoot this underwear story on him for Christmas, and he was like, okay. There was daylight coming into the studio, so it looked like he had just woke up. He went on the bed, which was a mattress on the floor, and Bruce just started taking pictures of him in this very, very expensive underwear from Saks Fifth Avenue. And the reason I'm saying this is the reason we got this underwear was because it had no logo on the band, which is very unusual. So it was all this very expensive white underwear from Europe, and Jeff was wearing it. A few weeks pass, the pictures come out, because it's a newspaper, the deadline is faster. Pictures come out, and I get these phone calls, because I was the menswear editor at Vogue, and one of the people says, we're trying to keep the pictures, this issue off the editor-in-chief, Grace Marabella's desk, because they're really, really racy. I thought, it's pictures of a guy in underwear. You see pictures of girls in lingerie all the time. What's the big deal?
Weber's lens captured a different kind of male ideal. For the first time, we were seeing an intimate portrayal of a young, athletic man. The male form as a sexualized object was historically the focus of gay porn, not mass media. What Weber had done was to legitimize the notion for the mainstream, and his water polo captain, Aquilon, made a stunning poster boy.
Saks Fifth Avenue, where we had gotten most of the underwear, canceled their advertising because of these pictures from Soho Weekly News. Now, Soho Weekly News was this very downtown newspaper. When the editor of the magazine said to everyone, oh, Saks Fifth Avenue has canceled our advertising, the entire place stood up and clapped. Because it was all about, at that moment, how far can we push things? How far can we go against the norm of what fashion is supposed to be, of what people think of male models, of what male beauty is, of what is acceptable for men to show? And showing a man in underwear was not acceptable except for in an ad. But to actually show a guy who looked like, he was in bed. People make up stories, which we now know about photographs, like, was someone in the bed with him? Why was the sheets messed up? It's like, so all these people filled in the blanks when we thought we were just taking pictures of Jeff. they've actually become, obviously very well-known pictures. We just thought we were taking pictures of someone.
Respected fashion writer Tim Blanks is quoted as saying, "From the 21st century vantage point, he looks like the natural evolution of an earlier male pin-up, Joe D'Alessandro." But where gay icon D'Alessandro's media channel was the X-rated movies coming out of the Warhol factory, Aquilon captured the popular imagination in the most overground way imaginable. His vehicle became Calvin Klein campaigns in mass-market magazines and Times Square billboards. Aquilon, as Weber depicted him, was to be the harbinger of the soon-to-follow 90s male supermodel era.
This moment in the industry where male models were sort of on the rise, Bruce captured it. Bruce definitely was interested in telling their stories and showcasing them in what men and boys do, and he did it very well. It was very intriguing, and he created iconic moments and glimpses into sort of that male world that I don't think had been shown before, other than Robert Mapplethorpe.
Many in the know will tell you that the Aquilon underwear spread in the Soho Weekly News was the catalyst for Weber being hired by Calvin Klein himself to create the image for the now best-selling Calvin Klein underwear line.
Probably it did, and I think it was, from the Soho Weekly News is how Bruce got the Calvin Klein underwear campaign, how we shot, the Calvin ads that were for men. I think it did change what we thought about men, how men should be photographed. Men were not photographed so intimately. Men were not photographed. There were much more sort of statuesque, much more images of male perfection. And Jeff, while really, really handsome, incredible body, still felt like a person.
For the new Calvin Klein underwear campaign, Weber cast another athlete for this debut. But this time he eschewed the pool for track and field. This time it was Tom Hintnaus's time to shine. The Olympic pole vaulter Weber scouted after Jeff Aquilon.
Em verdade que Thomas Hintnaus não chegava a ser brasileiro autêntico.
Calvin Klein chose to place Weber's campaign images on 7-story billboards in Times Square in August 1982. That's where Tom Hintnaus was revealed in all his glory, wearing just a suntan and a pair of Calvin Klein's now iconic white briefs. To the legions of American males still wearing boxers, Hintnaus in his tighty whities, through Calvin Klein's plan and Weber's lens, became an icon of male aspiration. Hintnaus was no Joe D'Alessandro. He was an all-American athlete, which in the end diffused the threat posed by Weber's homoerotic idealization.
Bruce had such a huge crew with him that they had their own production trucks full of camera equipment. Everything that Bruce needed was like big trucks, like real serious. Like Bruce would have 20 cameras on set sometimes, and he knows each one what film is in what, and he has someone holding, or he'll send for a certain camera, and it's just like, it's not a rinky-dink show. It's a serious budget being spent, and and you see why. You see why some of these budgets were so huge. I don't know the price number. I couldn't even begin to fathom what it was. I know what I was getting paid, but hell if I knew what everybody else was getting. But Bruce was getting a nice dime for sure. But it was worth it all in the end. No matter what they spent, we were making history before we even knew what making history was. Like, when you're in it, you don't really realize what you're doing. You realize that you're just trying to, put a roof over your head, live life, enjoy life, but not really understanding what was being done at the time.
Bruce would go on to define the visual worlds for many of the leading American brands: Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, Abercrombie & Fitch, Banana Republic, and countless others. In 2017, several male models had accused Weber of groping them during photo shoots. His alleged actions were so well known that models used the term Bruceified to describe it. When the news broke that models had come out alleging Weber of abuse, Condé Nast Global Chief Content Officer and Vogue Editor-in-Chief Anna Wintour suspended working with Weber. Longtime client Ralph Lauren would also suspend any future work with Weber.
The entire experience was terrifying and humiliating. I have suffered from depression and anxiety as a result of my photo shoot with Bruce Weber.
I've kept these and other secrets inside for the last 13 years. It's only been recently that I've had honest discussions about what's happened, and that I've talked to other young men who, like me, knew that if we protested or refused, we would be blacklisted, and not just from the shoot, but likely from our agency.
Weber had denied the allegations. The models accused the 75-year-old Weber of groping them during photo shoots, while saying he was simply helping them.
We did some breathing exercises, and we were shooting, and eventually I was nude, and he told me to grab his hand and put it where I felt the energy, and I was comfortable with that. So I put it on my shoulder, I put it on my chest, I put it wherever I was comfortable with, and then, he forced his hand on me inappropriately, and I didn't know what to do. I was 20 years old. I was in shock.
Weber chose to settle the matter, and his source said, "The settlement does not express guilt on the photographer's part. I have spent my career capturing the human spirit through photographs, and am confident that in due time, the truth will prevail," he said. Bruce has chosen to put this matter behind him and move forward with his life, a source close to Weber said. What happened next in the incubation of this male supermodel evolution came in the guise of Marcus Schenkenberg, Alex Lundqvist, Mark Vanderloo, and Tyson Beckford. The success of the female supermodels became an inspiration to their male counterparts. Seeing the template established, there was now a sense of what opportunities might exist for male models who were prepared to indulge the fantasy a little more.
I mean, the 1990s was a supermodel era with all the female models, like they were superstars. Linda Evangelista, Cindy Crawford, Christy Turlington, Naomi Campbell. I mean, they were bigger than life. Before I started modeling, like nobody even cared about male models. They were props to the women. They were in the background or like an accessory to the women. But I think I was part of that change. That actually they were interested in me, and they started doing interviews with me and asking me questions, which didn't really exist before then.
It was very much the beginning of the male models being known by name. Suddenly they started having their own personalities, and very strong personalities, and carrying stories on their own and getting covers on their own. And like I say, the George Michael video was definitely a turning point, to be alongside all those girls, but on an equal level. So I think it was definitely the beginning of male models becoming huge. They never earn as much as the women. It's the only industry where women still earn more than men, I believe.
And so came this early wave of 90s male supermodels, who were kind of familiar but foreign, straight but pliant, mainstream but edgy. And in this period, these men started to be marketed for the first time as supermodels.
I think the nature of the way the world was changing, and the celebration of the male physique, and that clothing was not necessarily for men's clothing was not necessarily a stereotypical suit and tie any longer. People became very health conscious and gym bunnies. And I think the new breed of men that came as a result of that were, in essence, the definition of the clothing that sparked their arrival. There was this feeling of emancipation. There was something where you saw men that were not afraid to embrace their sexuality or their physique and became as exciting on the runway as the women did. The shows became a celebration of who they were.
Around that time, I remember doing an interview where I explained the difference between model and supermodel, is that supermodels are people who are on TV just as much as they're on the covers of magazines. A model is someone who you don't know by name, but you know their face. You don't know anything about them, but a supermodel you know a lot. They're a celebrity, I said. What I ended up doing back then transcended just modeling. I was doing everything. I was in commercials, I was popping up in music videos, in magazines, I was on the sides of buses, on late night TV being interviewed, and then working with big brands like Ralph Lauren. A supermodel is a household name, I was quoted.
I would definitely say the 90s was a golden era for male models. I mean, because it was the era where you had to have some muscle on you. You had to have a physique. You couldn't be like these guys now, which you can't tell who's male or female or, you know, I mean, we're in an era now where you gotta look. But once the 90s hit, like some of us male models became household names, you know, from doing magazines, you know, shooting with other female supermodels and music videos. Oh my God, music videos put a lot of us into superstardom. For me, everything aligned. Ralph Lauren campaign, Toni Braxton video, you know, so many more after that. But it all aligned, and you know, we were like rock stars.
I just have to say this because it's just important. There's a man named Dan Dealey who really at that time, you know, there was Zoli, and Zoli had model agency too. And at the time in the 80s, the male model was everything in GQ. They really were. I mean, they were the most elegant guys. But what was so interesting about, reason why I have to give some credit to Dan Dealey, he had some of the best men always. Wilhelmina Men was always known to have the best men. And so then when you come along and you see at this given time, in the 90s, it so happened that this agency, Wilhelmina, got this guy named Sean Patterson, who so happened to have been some young guy. And I only use this as an example of like a Dan Dealey, because Dan Dealey was everything to the men's industry in the male model industry. So it was so interesting that he had the best, he had like 8, 9 guys. They all were top guys. That was the 90s. The interesting thing for me is I only got Tyson, and I have a lot of great guys, but they're all kind of like cool guys. They're not like but these guys that were at Wilhelmina, they look like the guys of the 80s. You know, they all are very good looking. My guys are more interesting looking. Some of them from London, some of them, you know, they're more street interesting, but not like this now, but better. And it was just interesting for me when I say this, because it was a very good time for the 90s for the male model, you know, with the Marcus coming out and, you know, having a Mark Vanderloo. There were so many good guys around. And even the ones that are not known right now, I remember them, and I can't even think of their names for the moment, but it doesn't matter because they were there. And what was so unique for me too is having someone like Tyson that just sort of fit right at that moment. So when it came down to editorials and stuff, they had to have Tyson, because Tyson was like, he was just going like this. And that was before we did Ralph Lauren. He was just going. So I think the 90s was a very wonderful time in many ways. So many good things happened in it and during, and there were a lot of wonderful male models.
Female supermodels were also instrumental in ushering in the male supermodels of the era. Before the men could get attention, the women opened the doors. Beckford and Schenkenberg both concede that the female supermodels who broke onto the scene before them in the early 90s, Kate Moss, Naomi Campbell, and Cindy Crawford included, made male supermodeling possible. It was a ripple effect, Beckford said. We became supermodels because of the women. We were working alongside them hand in hand. And when you shoot with a female supermodel, a few of them, then you become one of them and powerful like that. Whenever a new campaign debuted, eyes were already on the women. Men got attention at first by mere proximity. It was almost like their fame rubbed off.
90s was the supermodel era with all the female models, like they were superstars. Linda Evangelista, Cindy Crawford, Christy Turlington, Naomi Campbell. I mean, they were bigger than life.
In modelling, much like acting, there are no small parts. Though they starred in countless campaigns and editorials of their own, the men of the 90s also complemented their female counterparts at every turn. Taking supporting roles in photos now considered iconic helped to create some of the 90s best-loved images. Marcus Schenkenberg literally swept Stephanie Seymour off her feet in Richard Avedon's campaign for Gianni Versace, while Mark Vanderloo let Christy Turlington shine in the ever-popular commercials for Eternity.
Time can't touch us. Eternity for Men, Calvin Klein.
Long before Taylor Swift's revolving door of music video model love interests, Madonna set the standard. As one of the most prolific modelizers in history. Throughout the 90s, the Superstars videos provided male models with a platform watched by millions. Never one to settle, Madonna often handpicked her fashion it boys, from selecting guest face Richard Elms to play the object of her affections in the clip for Secret, to using then-boyfriend Tony Ward in the risque short for Justify My Love. It was not the exclusive domain of fashion, as Hollywood wanted a piece of this rise too. If you wanted to catch up with many of the 90s biggest male models, all you needed to do was turn on your television.
Hear that you're going now into acting too. Is this Beth Ann tells me your agent, my friend Beth Ann Hardison, is in the back. She tells me you're going to be a big actor now. What's that all about?
I don't know about being a big actor, but I'm going to try to do it though.
That's all you got to do is
I'm
try.
going to try. You're not a kid anymore. You can hurt yourself out there.
While models transitioning into acting is a time-honored tradition, the rate at which the 90s stars have made the switch speaks to their crossover appeal. Jason Lewis, Ian Somerhalder, Tyson Beckford, Antonio Sabato Jr., Jimon Hunsu, Colin Egglesfield, and Ashton Kutcher all found success striking a pose before making the move to the big screen. And then there were all those that followed: Channing Tatum, Timothée Chalamet, Travis Fimmel, Jamie Dornan, Mark Wahlberg, James Marsden, and Tyrese Gibson. But even as the 90s definitely was the rise of the male supermodel, the institution didn't really fully set. And as we entered the 2000s, the 90s male supermodel era was as ideal as it would ever get. The media fascination with Schenkenberg and Vanderloo depended on how much they were making or who they were dating, but neither situation was built to last.
The reason for those guys not having the longevity, I think at some point for them it was, it was cool at the time to just try to make some money. They just, they didn't know their career was going to take off, or maybe they just didn't want it as bad as I did. I think for me, I was so driven and so talented to want to do more. I wanted to act. I wanted to play in music videos. And I think that all kept me relevant. I just wanted so much more. And I feel like I've done maybe a quarter of what I really want to do. I look at some of the actors before me, I look at some of the models before me, and I say, at what point did they just say, okay, this is it, I'm going to stop here and then go off and do something else? I just never had that point where I said, I'm going to stop and go off and do something else.
What first encouraged this change were the clothes themselves. 90s fashion, and particularly clothes from the early part of the decade, were big, bright, glamorous, and overblown. The clothes had a big personality, so having a model with a big personality made those clothes shine. And just like the female supermodels gave way to heroin chic, the 90s era of the buffed male supermodel was waning. More than any other factor, what signaled the end of the male supermodel as a genre was precisely what helped usher them in. It was the clothes.
As you know in fashion, one day you're in, and the next day you're out.